In the summer of 2005, Amelia Fawcett achieved two remarkable milestones. She turned 50, and she sailed across the Atlantic Ocean for the first time. And in the process, she also raised about £300,000 for a breast cancer charity. Miss Fawcett is the true embodiment of a Wellesley woman who has and continues to make a difference in the world. A graduate of the class of 1978, Ms. Fawcett went on to making waves in England's financial services industry. She has been bestowed with numerous accolades and awards, the most notable being the CBE and a DBE, which from my understanding are Orders of the British Empire, and basically about the most prestigious thing you could get if you were in the UK. The Guardian, which is one of the four organizations for which Ms. Fawcett is a non-executive board member, called her a polymath whose reach extends beyond the boundaries of business, finance, and law. Not only does she serve on the boards of these incredibly reputed organizations, including our very own State Street in Boston, she is also actively involved in renowned philanthropic and art institutions such as the Prince of Wales Charitable Foundation, the US-UK Fulbright Commission, and Project Hope. A true inspiration and a role model, it is my honor to welcome Miss Amelia Fawcett.
Thank you very much. You would know that I was over 50 by the fact that I have to wear glasses. Needless to say, I am thrilled to be here, and thank you for your very kind introduction. One of the nicest things that someone can tell you is that you're an inspiration, so if I am, that's a great, great honor, and that's probably a nicer honor for me than being a dame or a commander. Or a dame commander, as the case may be. I am thrilled to be here. Wellesley was, and I'm not blowing smoke, a foundation for me. I would look at two things, my family and my background and my growing up here, and we can talk about any of this that you want to talk about, but also Wellesley. And what I went on to do, many of the foundations of that were here. So you're very lucky to be here. I was just saying that I wish they'd had this program when I was here. And as you'll see from my career, I pretty much skedaddled out of the United States within about 2 years of leaving law school because I was so passionately interested, and still am, in global interconnectedness and the international world. So you have a wonderful opportunity here, and I'd be very interested to have a conversation with you about how you think it's going. But if you told me in 1974, 5, 6, 7, 8 that I would be standing here as chairman of one of the world's leading media companies, I probably would have said you're smoking something and inhaling. But I am, and it is a great honor to be chairman of the Guardian Media Group, which owns the Guardian and the Observer newspapers, two of the oldest newspapers in the UK. And so today I want to discuss one of my lifelong interests, which is journalism. And as a child of the 60s and 70s and Watergate and Pentagon Papers, a very different world in many ways, which we'll come on to, not a surprise that I'm interested in journalism. But as a child growing up in the Boston area, we did get the Manchester Guardian from time to time. It came in the International Post. It was tissue-thin paper, and it had a blue banner that said Manchester Guardian, a very old-fashioned, almost Cyrillic type script. So it's very interesting. I've seemed to have come full circle. I'm now standing in a Boston area talking about the Manchester Guardian. But I want to give you some sense of the context and how rapidly the world is changing. And you know, I was saying just before we came in here, I feel a little odd talking about some of these things because you know about them more than I do. What I'm going to talk about and how it impacts what we do as journalists, you live every day. It's not a surprise to you, but for those of us slightly older than you are, gilding the lily a little, it is quite mind-bending. So how quickly the world has changed, how we're reimagining, as a friend of mine says, what things are, what that means for journalism, and if you'll allow me, I'd like to talk about that aspect of it in connection with The Guardian, because I think we have a very interesting and different perspective. And I'm obviously happy to, let me canter through this, but I'm happy to take questions not only on this, on anything else. If I don't have the answer, well, I don't have the answer. Interestingly, I thought I would be, if you'd asked me in '78 what I would be doing here, I would have said, oh, maybe I came back and I'm talking about the law. And I really did want to be a lawyer. I hadn't yet learned what an economist's definition of waste is. A busload of lawyers going off a cliff with one seat empty. But I did love it. It was very, very good. Before I start, I also should say that I am one of those people who passionately believes, as Hugh Cudlip did. Lord Cudlip was one of the great British editors of the mid-1900s, that journalism actually matters. And we can talk about Levinson and what kind of good journalism is, but journalism actually matters. And at its best, it has some kind of moral purpose and some kind of moral effect. So what happens to journalism and the decisions we take as editors and owners of newspapers and journalistic and news organizations, I think are of great significance to society as a whole. So if we turn to the second slide. So the question is, how on earth did we get here? Operative word, I suppose, is on earth. And what sort of journey have we been on? I don't know any of you seen this. It's a great video. This is not the video I was intending to show you. But there are some wonderful mind-bending facts, particularly for people of my generation. So if you go, I mean, did you know, for example, next slide, next, that there were 2.7 billion searches on Google every month in 2007. Do you know what it is today? Next. 31 billion. Next. The first commercial text message was sent in December 1992. Next. Today, more texts are sent and received every day than there are people on the planet. Next. There were 1,000 internet devices in 1984 and 1 million in 1992. Next. Last year, there were more mobile internet devices than humans. Mobile. Forget PCs. Next. And a week's worth of New York Times information is more than a person would learn in a lifetime in the 1700s. Next. And the amount of technical information we get every year is doubling, which means if you're starting a 4-year technical course, half of what you learned is out of date before you're a junior. How do you live and monetize and synthesize a world of that kind of exponential change? I honestly, I don't think I know. And it's had a huge impact on some of the devices and ways we communicate. So let's look at how long it took to reach 50 million people. So for the radio, it was 38 years. For television, it was 13 years. For internet, it was 4 years. For the iPod, it was 3 years, and for Facebook, it was 2 years. What do you suppose the people, as we say in the UK, who invented the wireless would have thought? You can reach 50 million people. That's the population that's the population of the UK in less than 2 years. I think they give you the same answer that they gave me, and much politer. That I just asked you question. I asked you answer I would have given you. You're smoking something and inhaling. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. So let's go on to one other background piece before I put this in the context. Next slide. A former colleague of mine at Morgan Stanley when I was there, another managing director, Mary Meeker, some of you may know if you follow internet trends, then known as the Queen of the Net, was one of the very first people in the 90s to see what this was, what the potential was, and also to see how you could make money in it and invest in it. She's now at Kleiner Perkins, which is one of the leading venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. And she continues to be a leading guru on internet trends and implications. And she has characterized where we are today in light of all of that as the reimagination of everything, powered by new devices and new connectivity. And I think it's an interesting backdrop to the discussion about the future of what was once a purely paper, us to them industry. So next slide. So this is the first generation. Next. After 125 years, landlines were passed by mobiles in 2002. Next. After 244 years, Encyclopedia Britannica finally went out of business last year. Next. After 305 years, and this is what really hurts me, Newspaper ad revenue was surpassed by the internet in 2010. And the reason, just from a purely economic standpoint, that that's scary is you don't earn as much money on a digital ad as you do on a print ad. So, this means, I think, well, I should say, you're the generation, as I said earlier, I suspect, that can't remember what life was without new media. Well, there is no more new media. It's just media. And it is the means through which we all now experience our world and influence our world. Next. So, what it's doing is it's reimagining what does it mean to be connected. Next. How do we share our experiences professionally or personally? Next. How do we get our news, and what do our magazines look like? Next. What does it mean to sit down with a book? There'll be people who won't know what a book is pretty soon. Next. How are we entertained? Wherever we want to, whenever we want to, however we want to. By the way, the chap in the top left corner was probably about my age, and I have to tell you, just like him, I was doing a lot of that in the 1970s. I didn't have quite such a nice mustache, though. And in the full circle vein, again, there's nothing new under the sun, I gather records are now back, and you can buy a record player. So all those records that I saved in the basement, I can now play them all over again. I was going to show you a video. No, I wasn't actually, I don't think. Yes, I was. I was going to show you a video, but I'm not. Oh, yes, no, I am. No, I'm not confused. Sorry. Video. Next, how we reimagine communication. These walkie-talkies, when the first mobile phones came out in the mid-1990s, they looked like a brick. And you'd be on a tube with it. Carrying around this great huge brick, and you were pretty important if you had a brick. Now everybody has a brick, and they're much more attractive than a brick, and in all sorts of pretty colors. And sports information, and how we get it, and how we interact with it, which brings me neatly to journalism. So, what about journalism? Next slide. So, for 2 to 3 centuries, and you were talking, I gather, about London in the 1600s, what's about then, the ability to communicate was in the hands of a few. Or go back to Gutenberg and the Bible. Finally, you could understand religion because Gutenberg printed a Bible. Well, the other arbiters of news were newspapers. The 18th century coffee houses, particularly in London, news was social. Interesting. We now have social media. And interestingly, our paper, The Guardian, was born as a 4-page weekly newspaper in May 1821. And then, and for a very long time, journalists were the sole arbiters of the news. They were authority figures, they were experts. Importantly, for your generation, they were gatekeepers. Next. So, consider today's competition. No longer just daily print newspapers as far as we're concerned. Go ahead. Take the summer concerts we have every year in London. They're called the BBC Proms. Now you can find out about them, just click through, through Guardian Review, BBC's own line, blogs, social media, Facebook, your own phone, or you could communicate about what you heard at the concert socially, seeking out people with similar mutual interests, families or strangers through social networks. And these are just a few of the examples. The web would be exploding with opportunity to experience and share this kind of activity. And it's all free, and it's all instantly accessible. And it's all bringing something new and different to the table. So, the big question, and I'm going to ask it now, and I'm going to ask you to hold that thought, is why compete with all of that when you can collaborate? So that's the question we found ourselves having to ask half a dozen years ago. Why are we competing with this? Why don't we collaborate? Why don't we join this? Different perspective if you go back to what I said the media used to be like. Slide 18. So before exploring the question of why compete when you can collaborate, I want to move beyond the what. What is journalism? How do you control the news? to the how journalism and who journalism. If you've watched any old movies from the 30s, 40s, or 50s, I suppose old now is the 70s or 80s, this fellow will be familiar. He is right out of central casting. He is the archetypical hack. He's the newspaper man, and often it really was a man, who beats the pavement, investigates, looks for the story, finds Columbo in a corner, gets the scoop, phones it into the editor, and the editor says, hold the first page. The editor then decides what's important, what gets published, when it gets published, gets it printed, job done, go home. That was the paradigm until not that long ago. Next slide. The 21st century model is very different. Virtually anyone can write, publish, and distribute their accounts of the world around them. You just need access to a PC or a mobile phone. So here's a novel idea. This is obviously 4 years ago. Look at this. I don't think anybody in that room doesn't have a phone. And you can be sure, because I was in a room next door, that every single photograph has gone somewhere within seconds. Every single one. And they'll have a take on it, and they'll want to tweet on it. So here's a novel idea. Why not ask those information producers to share what they produce with us? We don't have a monopoly. You haven't got that many Guardian journalists in that room, nor do they have a different perspective. So we call this open journalism, where we embrace changes brought about by the advent of the web. We don't resist them. So, what is open journalism? I'll rattle through these in a minute. It encourages participation. It invites and/or allows a response. It's not an inert us and them form of publishing. It helps form communities of joint interest around subjects, issues, individuals. It aggregates and/or curates the work of others. It recognizes journalists are not the only voices of authority, expertise, and interest. It aspires to achieve and reflect diversity as well as promoting shared values. It is transparent and open to challenge. A newspaper open to challenge, what a surprise. Including correction, clarification, amplification. It recognizes that publishing can be the beginning of the journalistic process, not the end of it. Back to transparency, open and challenge. It leverages and expands dramatically the capability of news organizations, as I hope I'll show you in a minute. It's a platform as well as a publisher. It deepens involvement of society not only in the news, but society and the issues we face. And it helps us all give a better account of the world for the world. That is open journalism. And that's what we believe is the future of journalism. Now, I would show you a video, but I'm told we can't. We cannot. Anyway, I'll send it to you. Someone should. It's an advert that we did called The Three Little Pigs. It won all sorts of awards that tries to explain moving from the newspaper. The Three Little Pigs get arrested for doing something nasty to the wolf, and it's very entertaining. But anyway, to try and show what, in a rather lighthearted way, what all this means. So I'll move on. Next slide. So new technologies are allowing stories to be sourced in many ways. I'm going to give you a specific example in a minute. Spot.us, which some of you may know, allows writers to search for community funding for their articles. Next. Social media has obviously played a critical role in key events, from the Hudson plane crash, which was one of the most visible ones of Twitter, to the Arab Spring. The single biggest provider of information to the people in Tahrir Square was The Guardian, through people's mobile phones. To the Osama bin Laden raid and death, to name just a few. Next. At The Guardian, we have seen some really important examples in recent years that has shown us the power of open, that has led to those principles that we've developed. In April 2009, one of our best investigative reporters, Paul Lewis, was interested in the impending G20 riots, which some of you may remember, and the talk of big protests, big briefings by the police on how violent it was going to be, and concerns about the safety of people in London. And he started to do a lot of work, end of March 2009. A newspaper seller, Ian Tomlinson, who was in front of the Bank of England, as you may recall, died during these protests. And there was a big debate about how he died. The police said the death was not suspicious. Paul, just naturally curious, 'cause that's the kind of guy he is, joined the crowd that convened online, not in an editorial office, to try and figure out, hundreds of people, what really happened. They sourced information via Twitter, Flickr, YouTube, Facebook, and also good old-fashioned journalism. He pounded the beat, he hit the streets, he talked to the family, he interviewed people, particularly before the riots, as far as what they thought was going to happen. Next slide. He reported on and investigated the techniques being used by the police. Next slide. Ian Tomlinson was killed, as I said. The police said, stoutly, it was by natural causes. He had a heart attack. They'd attempted to rescue him, spent a lot of time at it, and they couldn't because of a hail of bottles thrown at them by protesters. Paul, who'd been on the story, as I say, for several days, was skeptical. So he went back to the scene. He met the family. He tried to go back to the police. They warned him off and said, get lost. Not in such nice terms. He went to the Independent Police Commission. They said, we don't think there's a problem here. He finally won the trust of the family, and he began to tease out with them and others an alternative version of events. And the more he did, and remember, he's doing it online, the more he became a magnet for material and photographs and for people in the crowd. Next line. Next slide. Yeah. Within, is that the right one? Yeah, there you go. No, you're right. Within a couple of days, more and more witnesses were emerging, and Paul spoke to them all, hundreds of them, again, online. He gathered witness statements, he gathered videos, he gathered photographs. Next slide. Look at any crowd scene, okay? You'll see everything is being monitored from numerous angles in real time. Here, next, and here. Same event. I can count 15 photographers, most of them members of the public recording this moment. And if you did a 180-degree sweep, you could probably at least double that. These people are all reporters. And they even have their own websites in varying ways, however you want to describe it, publishing their evidence. Slide 30, yep, next. So the reporter did the work of the skeptical inquiry, shoe leather, he challenged, he inquired, he created, he sifted, he verified. Incredibly potent result when the two come together because he married it with what he was getting from mass observation by so many people. So he harnessed the best qualities of text, print data, sound, visual media, and if ever a route to building audience trust and relevance had to be found, I think it's by embracing all the capabilities of this new world, not walling yourself off from it. Next slide. So finally, all this came to a head on April 7th, several days after Ian Tomlinson died, when someone in the crowd, a hedge fund manager as it turns out, reading Paul's dogged work and his call to get people to give as much information as they could, went back, looked at his own footage because he remembered he'd passed by the Bank of England that day, and his shocking video came out. I don't have the video, but this shows him being pushed by the police. The police didn't try and resuscitate him. There were no hail of bullets. It's a very shocking video when you see what happens. And more than someone coming and telling a story or being a witness, the video itself made a huge impact and went round the UK. And the rest is history. The independent police commissioners had to do an inquiry. The police had to change their tactics. There was a new post-mortem into the death, which found very different results. Again, would never have happened had it not been for that collaborative work between the journalist and everybody else. Next. And this I'm going to quickly skate through because I think we're quickly running out of time. But how are we on time? Oh yeah, I want to leave time for questions, so I'll quickly skate through this. Go ahead. Yeah, a year later, in October 2010, someone was being deported from the UK, Jimmy Mbanga. He was guarded on a British Airways flight by G4S security. He died. Again, controversy about what happened. Paul did the exact same thing. And he used Twitter to help track down all the passengers on the flight who, let's be honest, got off the plane in Angola and went somewhere else. But he tracked them all down. Counterintuitively, for those who are used to traditional investigative journalism, it was all done in the open, all done on the web. Next. And again, this allowed him to map out who was where and then what they saw, which contravened what G4S had said, which was, we didn't restrain him, we didn't do anything, he just died. Turns out later that that was not a case. And the inquest did find death by restraint, but did not hold G4S culpable. Next. Technology now allows media companies to bring in more points of view. You guys have seen this. Think about HuffPo, which, by the way, may have started as an aggregator, probably an aggravator too, but now expanding into politics, generating original content. They won a Pulitzer Prize for their investigative journalism. They're doing, in the language of commerce and Mr. Christensen, they're marching up the value chain. Very interesting. I'll come on to that in a minute. Next slide. This I'd hoped to build, but I couldn't. So you just bear with me on, don't laugh at the right, but here we go on the left. Michael Billington, oh, it does work, oh great. Michael Billington, this man, funny looking man, has been sitting in the stalls of the theater for the Guardian since 1971. He is an expert. He's a great authority with professionals and the audiences alike. But does it mean that Billington and a handful of critics from other newspapers have a monopoly on what's interesting and important in the theater? Aren't you interested in hearing what others maybe in the audience think? Next. For instance, what's that lady think? Or this man think? I'd be very interested in what they had to think and how they actually reacted to a new form of the theater. So open news means you keep the expert, Mr. Billington, but you listen to the audience too. Next. Again, I won't keep going. Don't need those. Live blogging, which was pioneered by The Guardian in 1999. We first did it with sport, then we moved on to the news, and we began news events with the London 2 bombings in 2005. But readers don't just passively read live blogs, they interact with it. They send comments, they engage, they debate, they get angry. They're 2 times more likely to engage and comment with a live blog than they are with any other article. And an increasing number of journalists, including broadcast and TV journalists, put specialist material, their really hardcore thinking, and their engaging material in their blog. And the 10 o'clock news that they also do, by the way, it's icing on the cake. It's just not the job anymore. Next. Here's a story, keep going. We ran, oh, this isn't the set of slides. Okay, keep going. That's why I think, yeah, okay. Here's a story we ran on the cost of childcare and the impact on parents' ability to work. Its impact and reach was substantially affected by, no surprise, Twitter. As you can see, you probably can't because this is the wrong one, 96,203 unique browsers from the story on the first page of The Guardian, 382 tweets from the same page, 1,081 tweets overall, including retweets. 1.5 million people were reached by Twitter for this particular article. The daily circulation for The Guardian is 275,000. Next. Similarly, the news of Osama bin Laden's death went around the world not in 80 days, but in 3 minutes. In less than 12 hours of President Obama addressing the world to explain what happened, 40,000 blog posts and 2.2 million tweets from around the world. Next. And as The Guardian's reporting of the London riots in London 2 years ago, different ones, we seem to have a lot of riots in London, much like the other examples I've given, the story often starts with tweets, the photos. Next. Oh yeah, no, this is the wrong set of slides, that's why.
It's Albright Seminar 2015.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Keep going. Keep going. Next, next. Okay, stop. Using all the angles and all the media, hundreds of witnesses, live blogging, the story is told from many angles, and many people often are over many days. But unlike the journalism of old that saw the paper or evening news sum up the day, or the story finish when the paper went to bed. Next slide. Oh no, sorry, go back. Go back. It should be here. In the age of journalism, of open journalism, stories don't have an end. They develop continuously. So long after the riots, The Guardian was still working on the story with academics, with people who were there, and trying to tease out what the consequences and impact for London and elsewhere was of the riots. It also led to Reading Riots, which was a report and a book. Sorry, next. So, goodbye to all this? Well, in part. The newsroom at The Guardian is still a buzzy, fun, collaborative place. By the way, the cliché of the New World, in the cliché of the New World, most scoops have a life expectancy of 3 minutes. I'd rather think it was different for the Pentagon Papers. As the post-industrial journalism report that I think I circulated a summary of notes, much, and this is very important, much of the fate of news business will be decided by how new institutions become old and stable, and how old institutions become new and flexible. Fortunately, guess where we are? And we're working hard at it. But it's not the only place for our news, and it's not a closed, exclusive club. It's open, collaborative, and alive to partnerships. As our wonderful and visionary editor, Alan Rusbridger, would tell you, there is an irreversible trend in society which rather wonderfully continues what we as an industry started, newspapers in the UK and elsewhere. It's not a digital trend, that's just a shorthand. It's a trend about how people are expressing themselves, about how societies will choose to organize themselves, about a new democracy of ideas and information, about changing notions of authority, about the releasing of individual creativity, about an ability to hear previously unheard voices, about respecting, including, and harnessing views of others, about resisting people who want to close down free speech. And some of our partners are similarly strong advocates. I had a slide for GlaxoSmithKline, Google, and a variety of others about the importance of being open. So I hope I've given you some indication of what our world, how our world, in the journalism world, is changing, but how exciting it is. If you're interested, we can get into the economics of it, which are less, I think are very big issues. Particularly if you say, I can't wall myself off from the rest of the world, because if I do, all those people I've been collaborating with, I can't collaborate anymore. I've advised industries and companies and industries that have changed dramatically. You always knew what the end game was. The only question was who could get there quicker or build a better mousetrap. I've never been involved in an industry where nobody knows what the business model is this many years into this. Salzburgers don't know, the Murdochs don't know, we don't know, the Barclay brothers don't know. Nobody knows. It's scary, but it is full of hope and promise. And you all are probably already a huge part of it, I suspect. This is all, some of this is very new for people like me. So anyway, that's all I have to say. I'm happy to answer any questions. Good. Yes. I gather I have to wait for a mic. You're probably much more soft-spoken than I am. I don't even think that's even working.
Is this on? Thank you so much for coming today. I had to hold myself back from reaching into my bag and grabbing my phone and tweeting everything that you said, because I'm wondering, in this day and age of quick news, how do we maintain the art of processing and thinking critically when we're so tempted to just quickly report everything that we hear?
It's a great question, and I can't tell you the number of times I'm racing for something and I'm looking at my phone and I'm trying to sort something in my mind, and I can't think anymore. I just feel like all my processes are just going to go, which they sort of did this morning. And I think there has to, well, a couple things. I think there's also something about us taking responsibility for our own lives and remembering that instant news is interesting and fun. But at the end of the day, you have to find time to find things that are enriching and rewarding and take more time. Blogs and, I still read The Economist. I read it on the iPad, but I do read The Economist because actually, if I can find sometimes longer than an hour somewhere quiet, I go help some people on a farm, and I usually take the iPad and go find someplace in a barn where nobody can bother me, no phone calls. Because actually, I miss that. And that's one of the things that I loved about being here, was that idea that you would go, you'd have time to think and then discuss it with other people. And we've shortened that so much in the media. So I think there is a role for the media in terms of allowing communities and places for people to do that. So if I come on to what Open leads us to is the business model membership, where depending on how much you're willing to contribute, you get more time for that kind of processing and dialogue and analysis. But I think in an age when we want somebody else to do it, Dad has the answer, we kind of have to take responsibility for ourselves. And you're absolutely right, and I would strongly encourage you, don't lose that sense of wanting time for yourself to analyze and think things through. That will be very rich. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. With the age of the internet, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the ethics of reporting has changed, and also tie that a little bit into the accuracy of the news and reports we receive.
This is where I come back to something that I learned as a child in the importance of values, a code, a moral compass. Banking industry, I think they've lost their moral compass. Much of the media industry lost their moral compass. So think very carefully when you go to work for places or be with people. I think people who have strong values, it's very important. So that's one thing. And The Guardian's not perfect, and a lot of people don't like The Guardian. But I will say they do have a very strong code of ethics. That's the first thing. Second, the impact of the internet, not surprisingly, look at the hacking scandal in the UK, and how people figured out getting into voicemail from a mobile phone. So rather significant. Google, Google Earth, phones. It is having a huge impact, and potentially in some areas a very negative impact on how we live our lives and what society does. So it has a massive impact. In terms of how you deal with it, one, ethics, and the need for people in school, in journalism, but in their companies to have ethics. And you can't, as my mother used to say, you can't have a Queen Anne front and a Mary Ann back. You can't have one set of ethics at home, one set of ethics for work. It is a core to who you are, so ethics matter. And the good side of the internet, outing. When something's wrong, someone can get onto it and show that it's wrong, and then it's acted upon. Good government, free speech. But you need, the problem with the phone hacking issue was that nobody listened. The Guardian kept saying there's phone hacking going on. Nothing. Went to the independent, went to the Press Complaints Commission. You don't know what you're doing. Went to the police. Not an issue. Went to the CPS, not an issue. Went to the government, not an issue. And they kept saying, but we have evidence. Sadly, well, two things. It turned finally, A, with the help of the New York Times, who resurrected the story halfway through the process. And then sadly, in an era of sensational journalism, when it turned out that journalists had hacked the phone of the parents, of Millie Dowler, the girl who'd gone missing, then everybody said, that's enough. But again, that was only made possible by the internet. So I think ethics in journalism, this is the fourth estate, it's very important, and we have to be worried about free speech, but there are some obligations. So what Levinson, will be very interesting to see what Levinson does. The press have signed up to virtually all of his recommendations. The government has said, you must sign up to these. And the issue now is how they get regulated. They do need some kind of regulation. We actually are not that uncomfortable at The Guardian, because we feel our ethics are strong enough, to say maybe the regulator should be enshrined in statute, even if there is no statutory regulation, if you know of. So I think there's a role there for government and as well. And then there's the vigilance and support of people who will stand up and say, this is wrong. And the internet helps you do that. So it swings and roundabouts. Yes?
Okay. So thank you for your talk. My name is Lois. What strategies is The Guardian implementing to compensate for lost revenue as people are transitioning from paper subscriptions to reading their news online primarily?
Subsidy. No, just kidding. It is, as I think I intimated, it is the single biggest issue we face. So there are two ways you're starting to lose money, obviously. So it's both the decline in circulation and the decline of advertising, particularly display advertising. And as I said, for the first time ever, our online revenues for advertising exceeded our display advertising just a couple months ago. So that's a very good positive. But that isn't going to fill the gap. So we are looking at, as I think I indicated, something along the lines of membership. There's also sponsorship. So in ways we never used to do before, we're partnering sometimes with foundations. We've done one recently with an Australian foundation that's going to fund the Australian paper, the news initiative we just announced 2 days ago. So we never used to do that. So we're partnering with foundations for funding there. And then we're looking at the big thing is membership. In gradations, how do you get people? We know that there are 7 million people who share the values and are interested in the things The Guardian does. Our circulation is only 300,000. Online, we have 62 million people. No, almost 70 million people who read us online, a third around the world. And that's pretty good since we don't do marketing in the UK, in the US or in Asia. But are they actively engaged with what we do? Because we do believe passionately, and it has to be open. So, news has to be open. But are there layers and different things you can offer, either alone or with partners, to members in varying degrees? So I would say those are we're obviously doing digital advertising, but sponsorship, partnering, and membership. Whether it works or not, the good news is we're owned by the Scott Trust. So we don't have profit issues in terms of quarterly dividends to shareholders, and so we have to show sort of specific kinds of numbers. But it can't go on in perpetuity. But we have enough room, given the investment fund, to fund losses. We've brought them down dramatically over the last, we've had to, big transformation. We've had to bring those down. We think we can run with our portfolio a £10 million loss. And so we've had to figure out, because of our investments in other securities and things, we've had to figure out how to fill the gap. Yes?
My name is Nora. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your personal story and how you got to be chairman of The Guardian.
Good question. I left, as you were told, I left Morgan Stanley in 2006. Because I thought I had other things I wanted to do and could do, and I went on the board of State Street. And I was very worried that I would be characterized as a one-trick pony, that I would only ever be in the financial services bucket, a bucket I did not want to be in. And so I knew the chairman and chief executive, two different people, of the Guardian Media Group. And when they came to me and said, would you like to sit on our board? I said, I'd think about it. My initial reaction was no. I don't know why. And then I ultimately said yes. I was very fortunate at Morgan Stanley. I sat on the board of the Bank of England, which was like sitting on the board of the Federal Reserve. So I got experience of sitting on a board while I was still employed, and that was quite helpful. So I'd already had experience. And then if you go back another step, actually a history major and a law degree, the ability to process huge amounts of information, to spot issues, and something I learned here, listening and building consensus, very important skills when you want to go work, anywhere I'd say, but when you want to go on a board. I didn't expect it. I mean, as I said, life is not a straight line. I expected to be a lawyer, come back to Boston, maybe run for Congress, do all sorts of fun things. Well, I became a lawyer. I didn't come back to Boston. I went to New York, went to Paris, went to London. So I didn't plan it. And I think the only other thing I would say is I was willing to take risks, and when weird opportunities came, I gave it a chance and I analyzed it. And I would strongly encourage you to do that. Be prepared and open to the unexpected and to change. You will benefit from it. Ada.
So in an age of sensational journalism, as you stated, it seems like stories like the ones you presented, riots, deaths, are kind of dominating the news. So my question as an environmental studies major...
you'd like our environmental page. It is the best on the planet.
Okay, I'll have to check it out.
Literally.
But how do you see
But
issues...
I'm not biased.
How do you see issues such as climate change that aren't necessarily seen as urgent or crises, but I would argue are? How do you think those are going to fit into this new sensational kind of instant news that we have?
Harder on the instant news piece, but all kidding aside, I would encourage you to go to the Guardian environmental website. We have thousands of people who are contributing. And it is actually one of the things that we do spend a lot of time on. Sadly, as you know, it is an issue, climate change in particular is an issue that has divided so many people, and there are too many. I'm with you, by the way. One of the things I do is work for the Prince of Wales, and he has been for 35, 40 years a big proponent of this. So we are constantly trying to make sure that it gets coverage in the press. Again, it comes back, sadly, it comes back to two things, the top and the bottom. So is government making it a priority? So yes, there's a splash when Rio happens, or when there's a new legislative change, or when someone important makes a speech. The question is how we keep that alive and how we keep that dialogue alive, which comes to the bottom piece, which is people like you and me and others who are taking that story forward and continuing to educate and to engage in a dialogue. Because then what happens is the newspapers sort of see all this stuff going on and say, wait a minute, hold on, there's something going on here. We ought to be looking into this. But this is an area that I think is a particularly difficult one for most mainstream media, because unless there's a BP oil spill, it isn't the immediate issue. Interestingly, if you talk to the former CEO of BP, he will tell you that what killed them in the public mind was not the press. It was the Twitterati. They didn't know anything about it. They had no social media knowledge, no social media strategy, no social media plan, and that is what killed them. So I think what will be interesting is if you and I get together in 5 years' time, in light of what we've just seen, and in light of what's going on and the exponential rate of change, whether that has made more of an impact on what the news organizations rather than newspapers do. Nuha, sorry, my eyes aren't great.
Thank you so much for your talk. I've always been fascinated by investigative journalism basically, and in my mind I always think of investigative journalists as spies or detectives.
The coat, the hat.
Yes, exactly,
right.
Like Sherlock Holmes,
right.
I guess.
The shoe leather.
So I was wondering, what is the whole process involved? Like, what is the process of breaking a story first, and what are the dynamics between different news companies, like Guardian or any other like news agency in England?
It is, take some of it is, as I said, scoops last less and less and less time, and are then picked up. And they're often not picked up by other news organizations before they're picked up by people like you. Investigative journalism still is, as I think the Paul Lewis story probably shows, a lot of hard graft. You know, the old-fashioned, dogged, put one foot in front of the other, don't take no for an answer, be inquiring, be difficult, be challenging, be creative about where you look. But now what we've layered onto it, because this comes back to the question that you asked about time. You know, we don't have enough time. Now in a period of, it's all being done, condensed, if you will, in time. Now you have all sorts of other people that you can start to use, which means that investigative journalism, more often than not, is done in the open. Whereas before you were very quietly doing it and you read it on your newspaper and then you went like this in a little phone and called your editor. It doesn't happen like that anymore. So a lot of the old married with the new is what investigative journalism is like. The difference as well is, and it goes on and on and on. And then it's picked up by others and changed, and that they come up with a different angle on it. And so it goes on and on and on. So the idea of this finite process has been completely blown out of the water by new media. A lot of hard work, basically. Kirsten, got that right? Yeah, I think so.
Thank you so much for this perspective, and particularly about that idea that the media continues. There's no longer a stopping process. And I remember explaining that to my grandfather too, having that conversation because he watched the daily news every night, and
exactly.
And so it struck me when you were talking about that's the real shift. And so I appreciate all of the technical knowledge. I do want to ask one personal question that I think a lot of us will be facing is, how did you start establishing yourself in another country and starting a career there with continued relationships, friendships, family in the area you called home?
It's a very good question. A couple comments. One, when I moved to Paris from New York, people said, God, how did you, remember I went to school here and then I went to the University of Virginia for law school. How did you, and then New York and then Paris, how did you ever manage with a cultural shift from Paris? I said, nothing like the cultural shift from Boston to Virginia. So, which is true, actually.
I'm sorry, I'm a Virginian, so they've been hearing about that for the last 2 years.
So, but I think there is something I'd always wanted. Is you have to. There's something about being willing and open, and actively interested in change and in others, and kind of taking the rough with the smooth. I never forget, my grandfather told a lovely story about when he went to London the first time in the 30s, I think. And he went to Brown's Hotel. And he'd arrived late on the boat, and he was tired the next day. And he wanted to go out and get some fresh air and walk in Green Park. So he said, found a little bellman, and he said, excuse me, could you tell me where the elevator is? He said, sir, the lift is around the corner to the left. I said, yeah, fine, I just want to know where the elevator is. So, the lift is around the corner to the left. He said, look, buddy, I'm really tired. I need some fresh air. My grandpa was a tall man. I need some fresh air. Just tell me where the goddamn elevator is. So this guy takes him by the hand, and he round the corner, and round another corner, round another corner, and gets to the lift. He says, sir, the lift. He says, buddy, look, it says Otis. We invented it. It's an elevator. And the bellhop says, ah, sir, but we invented the English language, and it's a lift. So I think you have to be open to different ways of doing things. I think you have to be true to yourself. I think you have to have confidence in yourself. You have to be interested in what you're doing. And then I think you have to be willing to try and to experiment and to reach out to people that you wouldn't ordinarily reach out to. I can't tell you some of the people that I've met that I would never in a month of Sundays have met. And I think if you relish that and you take it for what it is, which is an enriching experience, it is just that. It is life enhancing. But I think, much like everything else we've been talking about today, it's about being open. It's about letting a little of yourself go and being willing to try and experiment. Yes?
So, just following
Sure, yeah.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, this is for recording. Yeah, I don't need projection either.
Oh, yeah.
So the first question is, what is worth reporting? Because every day we have a news briefing, and things we hear all the time is how many people are killed in certain places. And people say that because we are so exposed to these, we become immune, and it doesn't touch us anymore. And is this what news should be? And the second question is, with such superfluous of information, what is worth reading? Because as a college student, I'm happy to spend time, like, a lot of time with Facebook rather than reading something really worth reading. I guess people have this tendency to read something which is fun and easy to read, but not have much value. So how to resist?
I think on the point about what is news and what's worth reporting, I mean, it is a question of perspective to a certain extent. What is, what you might not think is newsworthy, someone else does. The fact that the potholes in some Cornish street have been a disaster for a long period of time and somebody's axle on a car broke, not particularly interesting to you. Quite interesting to people in the village in Cornwall, because actually somebody else doesn't want to have it happen. And by the way, now there are 36,000 different ways that you can get to your MP and everybody else to have it changed. So some of that I think is perspective. I agree with you that the focus on sensationalism and the negativity of the news, which has increased, I think, dramatically over the years, is very depressing. And sadly, that also is when everybody said, oh, the nasty journalists in the phone hacking thing, the News of the World, how could they print these things? They had the largest circulation of any newspaper in the UK. Someone's reading it. So there is a bit of an us and them issue there as well, which is there seems to be an appetite for some of this, which I think is a larger malaise in society, perhaps, as much as it is newspapers pandering to it and making money out of it. In terms of reading newspapers or reading the press, that goes back to that very good question about I need time to just sort of, instead of what comes at me immediately, I need time to reflect. I mean, you shouldn't, in this day and age, you shouldn't have news shoved down your throat. But on the other hand, I would argue that there are people with a really interesting perspective about some of the issues that you really care about that are worth reading. And you might find them in Twitter, and then that'll lead you to something else. That goes back to that sort of, that challenging, that opening to change, that exploring issue. I would, and actually we have a very big Facebook following, a lot of our Guardian stories that we would have thought were hopelessly not interesting, have 650,000 people reading them because someone read about it on Facebook. So I do get the interconnection. But if there's something that's of interest to you, I would have thought surely one of the things you learn here is that find out more, be curious. And the web does enable you to do that. Facebook enables you to do that. So do you stop at Facebook, or do you say when someone says to you, I saw a great article in the Economist about, and you like that, and you're very interested in that, well, maybe that's one way you get more interested in reading the press. Sam.
So hi, I'm Sam. Thank you so much for your talk. So recently a series of articles came out that discussed how social media is impacting our empathy, my generation's empathy, and it's decreasing our empathy towards others. And I also have this bit of a theory myself that because people want to post Facebook statuses and want to post tweets, we've stopped listening to each other to a certain extent, because it's all about who's going to like what I say and who's going to retweet what I say, and it's not about like what is a person saying. So I was wondering, with the empathy thing and also with this listening thing, how newspapers and news in general is taking this into account with their viewers and their readership.
That is a very good question. One of the biggest lessons I learned at Morgan Stanley from the then very senior partner was, you'll learn more at this place with these than you will with this. And that ability to listen and see what's going on around you and read is critical. I mean, I would argue that news organizations that do listen to the tweets and the blogs and the comments, and comment is free, are actually listening, encouraging others to do the same. But again, it comes back, I think, also to this age of instant, everything has to be done quickly, whether it's news or running for the plane or whatever, that I think has an impact on that empathy issue as well. And some to the extent you have an old-fashioned sort of model, I think that actually in many ways has the same impact in terms of that inability to listen. So I guess the question also comes is, the good journalist and the good news organization is continuing a dialogue. They're not just receiving from you. as are your friends and others, that somehow we have to go back to this instead of, it's a bit like my point, the story ends, the tweet never ends. It should be, we should be looking at it more as a dialogue, but we don't. Newspapers, I think, that engage with their readers do a little better job of that. Yes? Maya, sorry.
Hi, my name is Maya. And I wanted to ask you about print journalism. I have this sort of romantic view of newspapers, and one of my favorite memories of home is reading the New York Times with my family on Sunday afternoon. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you, what's the future of print journalism?
Well, it kind of depends on your generation a bit and the generation behind you. I think there are still people who, as you do, like to read the newspaper, but it is a decreasing number if circulation is anything to go by. But that may be because they don't like the way the newspaper doesn't work for them now in light of all this other news. And so the question is there a role for print journalism in the zeitgeist of all the rest of the ways you get the news? So let me give you an example. We did a survey of, we did focus groups with strong Guardian readers, and we discovered that the average Guardian reader gets the Guardian in the morning, flicks to the middle, which is where we have what's called the eyewitness page. It's their big photograph, and it's a free app on iPhone, on iPad. It's worth getting. Fantastic picture. They flip to the middle. They go back to the beginning. They go ding, 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 ding through the paper to figure out where the big stories are, where the stories are that interest them. They read a bit the opinion, because if they're a die-hard Guardian reader, that's what they care about. Close it up, put it on the side, go to work. They read the Metro on the train, on the tube. They get to work, they look at BBC, they look at all the different media they get during the day. They come home, and over dinner or afterwards, they go back to the Guardian, they take it off the shelf, and they read the 3 or 4 things that they really matter. Because they want to sit down. They want to hold it, but they don't want to sit down and have a, coming back to the conversation earlier, they want to have the time to really think about 3 or 4 core articles. So I suspect where newspapers will go, to the extent they do last, and there's a big debate, as you know, I would like to see them, they will look different. The news bit will be little buckets on the page, much the way you see the week or something like that, because everybody knows the news that's happening you're going to get online anyway. And then there'll be whole, then the really good investigative pieces. It might be on environmentalism, it might be on some big environmental thing, it might be on Jimmy Mbanga, it might be on the riots, will take up the bottom bit of the newspaper. And so it will be very much linked to and part of the web. Other than that, i.e. the old-fashioned everything's in the newspaper, that I think is dead. But I would like to think just like you. I mean, I like books. I have a Kindle, but I like books. I would like to think that the newspaper will continue, but it will look different. And it will perform a different service. Do a different job in the language of Christensen. Yes, Tricia.
So my question was about with the access and speed at which people can access information from the internet and social media, how do journalists deal with the fact that information they might be reporting on or publishing might be redundant? How do they offer like a new perspective so that people remain interested in journalism?
Let me give you a good example. Jemima Kiss, who's our technology reporter, go back to what I said about our circulation's declining, about 275,000, I guess, now. She has 1.5 million people who follow her on her blog. And the reason they do, just because, and there's an industry that really is fast, moving quickly, she's constantly talking to and interacting with lots of people around the world about whatever it is that she's working on. So she's in the middle of the big technology expo in Las Vegas, and she's saying, oh, I'm hearing this about this new app, what are you guys hearing? 250 people inside of seconds are giving her new information. But that's a lot of work. I mean, that is, I think, a very different way of thinking about your journalism than just doing a little bit of investigation and then moving on. So I think you have to, what journalists now have to do is to constantly, almost have eyes in the back of their head, constantly looking around and listening, comes back to that point. They have to listen by seeing what's on the web to what others are saying and to what is out there in varying different ways. But that is a much harder job than it was before. And not everybody succeeds. Kelsey.
So that's the last question.
Oh, right. Oh, you shouldn't have talked as long. We could have done more questions.
Hi, thank you for speaking to us today. My question is about your work-life balance. You're obviously a very busy woman, and you mentioned spending time going to a farm and that being your time away. So I was wondering how you've managed that over the years.
I would say it's one of the things that I have focused the most on. A realization that you can't run at 150 miles an hour without every once in a while stopping the car for gas, or petrol as we say in the UK. And for me, that has been fly fishing, which I learned with my grandfather. And I'm, as often as I can, I have a farm in Wales, my own farm in Wales. I go to the farm and then I fly fish. That's also my friends. I spend as much time as I can with them. Sometimes, believe it or not, it's sitting down in front of a fire and reading a book. Had I not done that, I would argue, and in some instances I have to focus very hard to do it because the tendency is, I haven't got time for that. Had I not done that, I don't think I'd have done everything that I've done. And I also think it wouldn't have been as much fun. So what I would say is, you know, whatever you do, you should be bloody good at it. You should take time away from it. You should find what excites you and drives you and focus on it. You should be willing to laugh a lot, including at yourself. And you should be prepared to have fun, because you'll have fun in almost anything that you do. Again, if you open yourself up to it and say, actually, that's an important thing to do.
Please join me in thanking Amelia.